What if a single conversation could shake the foundation of global diplomacy? What if a voice from Washington echoed through the heart of Africa and stirred a revolution of respect? This is not just politics, it's a story of fire, truth, and dignity reclaiming its name. As borders blur and words ignite, one woman dares to speak what history often silences. Tell us, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these voices alive. In a scheduled diplomatic video call between the United States and Burkina Faso, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett did what few expected. What was meant to be a routine conversation on trade agreements and aid distribution subtly shifted into something deeper. Speaking with calm authority, Crockett leaned forward into the camera and began to talk, not about logistics, but about dignity. I want to thank Burkina Faso for reminding the world that sovereignty isn't a performance for cameras, but a commitment lived by the people, she said. Her voice was steady, deliberate, piercing through layers of protocol like a soft chisel. She didn't read from notes. She spoke from memory, invoking the legacy of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader known for his fierce independence and rejection of neo-colonial interference. President Ibrahim Traoré, seated in the presidential hall of Ouagadougou, remained quiet at first. Behind him, national flags fluttered gently, but it was his eyes that shifted. Not with offense, but with something closer to recognition. The call, previously stiff and framed by policy briefings, took on a new tone. Too many African nations, Crockett continued, have been asked to trade respect for resources, dignity for dollars. But your country reminds us that it's not charity that builds nations, it's character. The room on both ends fell quiet. For President Traoré, the reference to Sankara wasn't just political. It was personal. The young leader had long admired the late revolutionary's ideals, but rarely had he heard them acknowledged with such reverence by a foreign official, let alone from one in the West. And for a moment, borders, titles, and talking points disappeared. What remained was a connection. A rare, human moment between two public figures who understood that diplomacy, when done with sincerity, could be as soul-stirring as any speech ever delivered in a parliament. As the call progressed beyond expected diplomatic small talk, U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair and made a deliberate choice, to shift the tone from procedural to personal. Her eyes, steady and intent, focused on the screen where President Ibrahim Traoré listened from his modest presidential office in Ouagadougou. What followed was not part of any scripted agenda. I grew up underestimated, she began, her voice calm but anchored in something far deeper. People saw my skin before they saw my potential. They mistook my silence for submission. They confused my service for weakness. But I learned early on that leadership isn't about climbing ladders. It's about holding them steady for others. President Traoré's expression shifted subtly. His brow eased, and his eyes narrowed, not out of skepticism but attention. There was no translator needed for what she said next. You know this, Mr. President, she continued. Because I've watched how you lead. You don't sit above your people. You walk among them. And that's what power should look like. Not fear. Not control. But presence. Her words struck a chord not often touched in the world of diplomacy, where formality often muffled truth. She wasn't just drawing parallels between two unlikely political figures, an African revolutionary turned head of state and an African-American congresswoman. She was crafting a definition of leadership that neither culture nor title could distort. You are a reminder, she said, that dignity is not earned through foreign validation. It is built by showing up for your people, especially when the world turns its back. The silence that followed was not awkward, but reverent. President Traoré, still seated, placed both hands flat on his desk. You honor me, he said, voice quiet but heavy with sincerity. And you remind me, service is the only legacy worth leaving behind. The atmosphere in the presidential chamber was unusually still. The midday light filtered through tall windows, casting gentle shadows on the polished wood floors. President Ibrahim Traoré stood by the window, his back to the ornate desk, hands clasped loosely behind him. Across the room, the screen displayed the paused image of U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her expression mid-sentence, earnest, defiant, and resolute. She had just spoken of her beginnings, a story that, despite oceans and histories between them, felt deeply familiar to Traoré. He had heard many diplomatic speeches in his time, but few had ever veered from policy into the vulnerable terrain of personal truth. Crockett's voice, transmitted over encrypted channels and shielded from the world's interruptions, had found a private frequency that resonated not just with his mind, but with his memory. "I wasn't supposed to be here either," she had said. "Not in Congress. Not leading anything. Not speaking on behalf of a country still learning to see people like me as part of its soul." There was no false modesty in her tone, no rehearsed humility. Just truth. She went on to describe growing up in a neighborhood where power was something seen on television, not in person. Where leadership looked nothing like the people around her. She talked about being underestimated, passed over, and told implicitly and explicitly that ambition was not meant for her. But she also spoke of resilience, not as a slogan, but as muscle memory, inherited from generations who endured. President Traoré, still standing silently, was taken back to his own childhood. To dusty village roads, to evenings under candlelight reading from borrowed books, to elders who whispered dreams of freedom even when surrounded by echoes of colonial subjugation. He thought of Thomas Sankara, not as a statue or a slogan, but as a man who had once sat in this very country, unshaken by Western derision, insistent that dignity was not a request, it was a right. Crockett spoke of that very principle. Leadership, she had said, isn't about dominance or pageantry. It's about whether your people can walk with their heads held high. It's about making room for stories like mine and like yours to become the new norm, not the exception. Those words had brought Traoré to the edge of emotion. For years, he had carried the burden of representation, of being the leader who had to hold back the tides of external control while fending off internal disillusionment. He had given speeches before international bodies, heard the polite claps, read the sterile reports. But here, in the stillness of his own office, he had just been seen. Not as a president. But as a person. He walked slowly toward the screen, the weight in his chest no longer political but personal. "Congresswoman," he said, voice quiet yet steady, "you reminded me why I started this." There was a pause. A rare, unscripted pause in international diplomacy, one that did not beg to be filled. And in that pause, a moment of clarity. He did not need to defend his choices, nor explain the path he had walked. He only needed to acknowledge what had just taken place. A moment of truth between two leaders, bound not by treaties or economies, but by the shared knowledge that dignity, once claimed, must be protected. He stepped back from the screen, signaling to his aides not to disturb him. He needed this stillness. He needed the echo of her words to settle into the room. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A clip surfaced online of the diplomatic exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Ibrahim Traoré. Specifically the moment when Traoré stood and uttered, "You reminded me why I started this." Within hours, the video was clipped, subtitled, and translated into multiple languages. Activists in Dakar, students in Nairobi, journalists in London, and civil rights leaders in Atlanta shared it with captions like, "Real recognizes real," and, "When dignity speaks, history listens." The speech, and its unexpected emotional aftermath, sparked conversation across the global South. Political scientists noted its rarity, a conversation between an African president and a U.S. congresswoman that felt more like a moral summit than a geopolitical exchange. It was not about aid, defense, or trade. It was about vision. About dignity. In Burkina Faso, something began to shift. At a community arts center in Kédougou, local youth sculptors recreated the iconic moment in wood and clay. They depicted Traoré standing at his desk, hand over heart, facing a glowing screen. Across the Atlantic, a mural began to appear in southeast D.C., showing Crockett and Traoré with a line between them not of conflict, but of light. Civil rights veterans across America hailed the exchange as reminiscent of the global solidarity of the 1960s. "It wasn't just what she said," one elder commented. "It was how she said it, and who she said it to, and the fact that she meant it." Meanwhile, critics emerged, particularly within the Beltway political establishment. A handful of conservative media outlets accused Crockett of glorifying authoritarianism, pointing to Traoré's unorthodox rise to power and his defiance of certain Western protocols. To this, Crockett responded not with retreat, but with resolve. "The world has long romanticized silence, not sincerity," she told a room of reporters. "What I said wasn't a political endorsement. It was a recognition of a truth that too many are afraid to speak, that dignity matters more than decorum." Her words, once again, struck chords. In villages across Burkina Faso, radios replayed segments of the call. Children began asking who Jasmine Crockett was. Elders smiled, recognizing a new kind of diplomacy, one where words weren't weapons, but windows. A few days later, in a remote village in the Cascades region, President Traoré made an unannounced visit. The villagers gathered in awe as his motorcade stopped before the community center. There, a young boy named Tano stepped forward with a gift, a small hand-carved sculpture of two hands joined at the wrist, one etched with African motifs, the other with stars and stripes. "It's for her," Tano said shyly. "To say thank you." Traoré knelt before the boy, accepting the gift not as a politician but as a man deeply moved. The moment was photographed, shared, and immortalized as the image of diplomacy reborn. This was no longer about speeches. It was about symbols. Back in Washington, Congresswoman Crockett was summoned to a Senate hearing. The room was charged. Senators questioned her tone, her motives, her alignment. "Do you stand by your remarks?" one asked pointedly. "Absolutely," Crockett replied, her voice unwavering. "Dignity isn't disruption. It's reckoning. And if you're uncomfortable, perhaps it's time we all reflect on why." She walked out of the chamber with no apology, only clarity. That night, President Traoré sat in his study with the sculpture from Tano on his desk. He replayed the call with Crockett once more, but not for answers. For reminder. The echo had not faded. It had only just begun. The video clip of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's address did not take long to ripple across digital borders. What started as a moment in a scheduled diplomatic exchange quickly evolved into a viral cascade of reshares, screen captures, and transcripts translated into dozens of languages. Her words, unscripted yet piercing, landed with such velocity that even platforms typically slow to acknowledge anything outside traditional power circles picked it up within hours. In the speech, Crockett did not quote legislation. She did not reference conventional data or policy points. Instead, she spoke of dignity, of the human need to be seen not as collateral or statistical residue, but as beings deserving of respect. She named it plainly: the world has romanticized silence for far too long, mistaking the absence of disruption for peace. "Sincerity is the new revolution," she said, a phrase that would soon be printed on protest signs and classroom posters alike. Civil rights leaders in the U.S. hailed the speech as one of the most defining political statements since the early Obama years. Media outlets compared it to Barbara Jordan's iconic addresses and the unfiltered conviction of Shirley Chisholm. From Atlanta to Accra, Crockett's message was not simply heard, it was felt. Yet not everyone welcomed her boldness. Political commentators on the right accused her of glamorizing authoritarianism, claiming she had been manipulated by a foreign regime. On cable news, a panel of pundits dissected every syllable of her speech, questioning her patriotism, her judgment, and even her qualifications. "She's romanticizing someone who governs with a strong fist," one anchor stated, while others echoed similar sentiments, framing her remarks as naive or dangerous. Crockett, when approached by journalists outside Capitol Hill, did not flinch. The world has spent decades romanticizing power structures that silence people, she replied. If recognizing dignity in others makes me radical, then perhaps we need to ask why dignity is still considered disruptive. Her answer, clear-eyed and unrepentant, sparked another wave of reactions. Universities invited her to speak. Youth activists created digital campaigns under hashtags like #DignityIsReckoning and #SincerityRevolution. In Burkina Faso, murals of her words were painted across school walls and community centers. Traoré, upon hearing of the growing wave of support, reportedly said in private to an aide, "She has given voice to something we always knew, but no one from her world ever dared to say aloud." The backlash intensified in Washington. A scheduled Senate hearing on African relations suddenly included a new panel focused solely on Crockett's speech. She was summoned to explain her remarks. Political opponents sought to turn her words into liabilities. But Crockett came prepared. In the hearing, she did not retreat from her stance. Instead, she doubled down, drawing a clear line between complicity and courage. Dignity is not a disruptor of democracy. It is its foundation. If our diplomacy cannot hold space for respect, then perhaps it is diplomacy that needs revision. The room, silent at first, crackled with tension. Some senators leaned forward, visibly taken aback by the boldness of her testimony. Others leaned back, arms crossed, already scripting rebuttals. But what none of them could deny was that her words had shifted the atmosphere. Beyond the hearing room, the debate over Crockett's message fractured along ideological lines. But in communities around the world, those long ignored by international policy or reduced to footnotes in white papers, her words held a different weight. They were not just heard. They were believed. In a Johannesburg classroom, a teacher paused her lesson to discuss Crockett's quote on romanticized silence. "What do you think that means?" she asked her students. A young girl in the back answered, "It means that being quiet doesn't always mean things are okay." In Lagos, a street artist recreated Crockett's silhouette in bright spray paint, her hands outstretched like a scale of justice, with the phrase, "Kindness unites worlds," beneath her image. And in Washington, D.C., within the halls of Congress, whispers began to circulate. Not just about whether Crockett would survive the political storm she had stirred, but whether she had sparked something bigger than herself. A new discourse. A moral recalibration. In an era defined by slogans and soundbites, Crockett had done the unthinkable. She had made sincerity feel revolutionary again. And the world was listening. In the quiet heart of a rural village in Burkina Faso, where the red earth bore the memory of centuries, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped from his convoy and into the arms of his people. This was no ordinary visit. Word of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's recent speech had reached far beyond the diplomatic chambers of Washington and the streets of Ouagadougou. It had seeped into the homes and huts, into the stories told over cooking fires, and into the imagination of a new generation. Among the villagers gathered to welcome the president, a young boy named Tano stood nervously by the edge of the crowd. In his small, dust-covered hands, he held a wooden sculpture he had carved himself. It was imperfect in shape but overflowing with intention. The sculpture depicted two open hands cradling a heart, with the word "Dignite" etched beneath in blocky but proud lettering. When Traoré was told the boy had something to offer, he motioned for Tano to step forward. The crowd grew hushed. Tano approached slowly, bowing as he presented the sculpture. "It's for you," he whispered. "Because you listened when others didn't. Because she saw us and you believed her." The moment cracked something open in Traoré. He knelt down to meet the boy eye to eye, accepting the sculpture with a reverence usually reserved for national treasures. "Merci, Tano," he said softly. "You remind me why we fight." Photographs of the exchange soon spread across social media, not through official press releases, but from villagers with old smartphones and slow connections who knew they had witnessed something sacred. No filters, no speeches. Just the image of a president receiving a child's carving as though it were a state medal. What that moment represented could not be overstated. It signified the deep ripple of Crockett's words across oceans and institutions, into the hands of a boy who carved his belief in dignity out of scrap wood. Her message had become more than political philosophy, it had become praxis, living in gestures, not just in legislation. International observers noted the moment with quiet astonishment. Here was a rural child, far from power centers and polished halls, speaking a language of hope without uttering more than a sentence. And here was a head of state, still new in his role, still controversial in the eyes of some, embracing that language without condescension. Later that day, during a village meeting under a baobab tree, elders spoke of the gift not merely as a symbol, but as a sign. A child who carves unity with his hands, one elder said, is safer than any speechmaker. Traoré did not speak long that afternoon. He didn't need to. He placed the sculpture at the center of the table where ministers and local leaders Saturday. This is what we protect, he said, not just land or borders, but the belief of a child in a world that doesn't mock dignity. That night, the villagers held a modest celebration. Not for politics, not even for the president, but for Tano. His gift, they said, was a reminder that power means nothing if it cannot kneel before innocence. Meanwhile, in the capital, Crockett's staff received the photo of Traoré and Tano. Jasmine sat with it quietly for several minutes. She asked her assistant to print it, not for publicity, but to pin beside her desk. That, she said, is the reason you speak even when they tell you it won't matter. And far away, a small boy slept with dirt on his knees and pride in his heart, knowing he had handed a piece of himself to his country's leader and that it had been accepted with open hands. That night, he dreamed not of palaces or power, but of more wood to carve, and more ways to say, in his own voice, that dignity was not something given, it was something deserved. The air in the Senate chamber was heavy with scrutiny as U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took her seat at the witness table. News of her impassioned words to President Traoré had already reached every major network. But while supporters heralded her as a voice for a new global ethic, many lawmakers and media pundits accused her of glamorizing rebellion and undermining diplomatic protocol. Now, she was being summoned to explain her remarks, not to foreign leaders, but to her own colleagues. Facing a semicircle of senators, Crockett maintained a calm, measured posture. Her hands were folded in front of her, her notes untouched. Though the room buzzed with undercurrents of tension, she wasn't rattled. To her, this was not confrontation, it was opportunity. Senator Lowell, a senior voice on the Foreign Relations Committee, leaned in. Congresswoman Crockett, were you aware that your words would be interpreted as legitimizing anti-Western sentiment? That invoking Thomas Sankara would be seen as romanticizing defiance against established global norms? Jasmine met his gaze without blinking. I was aware, she said, that honoring dignity over deference would ruffle feathers. But I did not speak to flatter empires. I spoke to affirm that people everywhere deserve to be treated with respect, not as pawns in someone else's game. A murmur swept through the chamber. It wasn't defiance they heard. It was conviction. Senator Morales, a progressive voice from California, offered a different tone. Your words moved millions, Congresswoman. Do you believe this moment could shift how we approach diplomacy? I believe it already has, Crockett replied. Because for the first time in years, I've received messages from both African youth and American teenagers who said they finally saw themselves in international leadership. Not as charity cases or afterthoughts, but as equals. The hearing continued for over 2 hours. Questions ranged from nuanced diplomatic strategy to overt insinuations that Crockett had acted recklessly. One senator asked if she had cleared her message with the State Department. Another pressed on whether she regretted bypassing traditional talking points. But Jasmine Crockett remained steady. We've spent decades romanticizing silence, not sincerity, she said. We applaud polished speeches that say nothing and call them diplomacy. But when someone speaks plainly about dignity, we panic. That panic is not because the words are dangerous. It's because they demand we change. As the hearing reached its conclusion, Crockett delivered a closing statement that wasn't on her prepared remarks. If we are afraid of the world hearing the truth, then we are no longer protecting peace. We are protecting privilege. I spoke to President Traoré the way I wish more of us would speak to each other. With respect, with honesty, and without needing to prove who's in charge. Outside, reporters swarmed the Capitol steps. Commentators called it the Crockett Doctrine, while critics labeled it reckless idealism. But across the Atlantic, in the presidential offices of Burkina Faso, Traoré and his ministers replayed the hearing footage on a loop. Watching Jasmine defend dignity in front of her peers, the ministers exchanged glances. One chuckled, shaking his head. We should hire her to write our speeches. Traoré smiled for the first time that day. No, he said. Her voice is stronger where it is. Because it reminds us that courage doesn't need borders. And in that moment, the halls of power in two nations echoed with the same truth: dignity, once spoken aloud, cannot be silenced again. Back in Washington, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood inside the gymnasium of a public high school nestled deep in southeast D.C. The walls were lined with faded banners from basketball championships past, and the wooden floor bore the scuff marks of 1,000 sneakers, but tonight, the space held something different, a silent electricity that buzzed in the hearts of the students gathered. The event was initially planned as a standard civic engagement session, a way to encourage youth participation in government. But after Crockett's now famous remarks during the diplomatic video call with President Ibrahim Traoré, word had spread fast. Students came not because they were required to, but because something in them needed to. They had seen the clips, read the headlines, felt the tremors of someone who spoke not just for the system, but to it. Jasmine stood at center court, without a podium, without cue cards, dressed not in her congressional blazer but in jeans and a plain black shirt bearing the words, "Lead with dignity." She smiled at the crowd, teenagers of all colors, postures, and attitudes, and took a breath. I grew up being told I was too much of something, she began. Too loud. Too ambitious. Too black. Too bold. But what no one ever told me was that I could be all those things and still be exactly what my country needed. A hush swept across the gym. Phones were down. Heads tilted up. She spoke of President Traoré and how his fight for dignity wasn't about grand speeches or expensive suits but about not being afraid to look his people in the eye and promise he wouldn't forget them. And that, she said, pointing gently to the rows of wide-eyed students, is what I see in all of you. The speech wasn't long, but it was transformative. Crockett spoke about policy, yes, but more importantly about possibility. About what it meant to be underestimated, to be questioned, to walk into a room and have to prove not just your intelligence, but your right to exist. Leadership isn't about who you command, she continued, it's about who you serve. And sometimes, the first person you need to lead is yourself. A murmur of assent flowed through the students. Then hands began to rise. A girl in the front row asked, "How do you deal with people who don't think you belong?" Crockett paused, then smiled. You don't prove them wrong. You live so fully that their doubts shrink beside your presence. Another student, a boy wearing a threadbare hoodie and the burden of quiet responsibility, asked, "What if you're scared you won't make it?" Crockett nodded. Then you walk anyway. Because the most powerful steps are the ones you take while still afraid. By the end, something had shifted. These weren't just students anymore. They were witnesses to a moment that validated their existence, that dared them to imagine themselves as leaders not in spite of who they were, but because of it. Teachers wept quietly in the bleachers. Journalists, who had shown up expecting photo ops and platitudes, found themselves lowering their cameras. No image could quite capture what it meant for young, black, and brown students to see a woman like Jasmine Crockett standing before them, not as a politician, but as a mirror. As the event closed, Crockett walked off the court and was swarmed by students. Not for autographs, but for conversations. Real ones. They asked for book recommendations. They asked for internship advice. One student simply said, "Thank you for seeing us." Crockett looked around and knew, this was why she fought. Not for headlines, not for clout. But for this. For them. And for the world they would go on to change. As the sun began its slow descent over the civic plaza in Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a crowd that had swelled beyond expectation. People from neighboring villages, local towns, and even regional capitals had made their way to this place, drawn not by fanfare, but by a message that had taken root in their hearts. It was not just a political rally. It was a moment of affirmation. The space was quiet as Traoré took the stage, the air thick with anticipation. He wore no grand robes or medals, only the traditional cotton tunic of the people, a deliberate choice. As he looked across the crowd, his voice rang out clear and firm, "Dignity is not a luxury. It is a right." The words echoed across the plaza, cutting through the still air and planting themselves in the consciousness of all who listened. Traoré did not speak of foreign policy or economic reform. He spoke of worth. Of the inherent value in every citizen regardless of their birth, their poverty, or their pain. He thanked those who had come to listen and reminded them that the power of a nation rests not in aid packages or foreign investments, but in how deeply it respects its own people. Simultaneously, thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett appeared on a live video stream, projected onto a screen set beside Traoré. Her image flickered momentarily before stabilizing. She spoke not as a foreign dignitary, but as an ally and sister in the global struggle for justice. "Respect," she said, "is the greatest gift one nation can offer another. Not charity. Not pity. But the acknowledgement of equal dignity." Her words drew spontaneous applause from the crowd. As the feed ended, the people did not rush to leave. They lingered, children perched on shoulders, elders wiping tears, young people recording every moment. The speeches may have ended, but the spirit of the message endured. It wasn't a typical political event. It was a beginning. In that plaza, surrounded by faces of every generation, a silent understanding passed among them. They were seen. They were valued. And for the first time in a long time, dignity had a voice, and it sounded like their own. In the aftermath of a speech that had shaken diplomatic norms and reignited conversations across continents, U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat under the blinding lights of a televised interview studio. The backdrop behind her was crisp and neutral, but the questions ahead were anything but. The interviewer leaned forward, her voice measured but edged with challenge. "Congresswoman Crockett, would you do it all again? Knowing the backlash, the media storm, the political scrutiny. Was it worth it?" Crockett didn't hesitate. Her eyes didn't flicker toward the cameras or the audience monitors. She answered not as a politician seeking favor, but as a woman whose conviction had already been tested in full view of the world. "Yes," she said plainly. "I would." The response echoed across the screen. In that instant, it was not merely a soundbite, it was a reaffirmation. "Because what I said," she continued, "needed to be said. The world has spent too long romanticizing silence, not sincerity." The statement struck a chord. Across social platforms and news outlets, it was clipped, quoted, and replayed. Critics accused her of elevating a controversial figure. Supporters lauded her for finally placing dignity at the center of diplomacy. But the debate itself underscored her point: people were talking, not in whispers, not in shame, but with urgency. In the days that followed, a phrase from her earlier remarks began surfacing in unexpected places: "Kindness unites worlds." First, it appeared as a mural on a wall in Bobo Dioulasso, where schoolchildren traced it with their fingers. Then in lyrics of a grassroots folk song in Niger, sung beneath the shade of a baobab tree. Soon, it found its way into classroom posters, hospital corridors, even the handwritten signs of market vendors who had once feared being ignored. This wasn't just the echo of a speech. It was the ignition of a deeper current, an understanding that Crockett's words had leapt beyond geopolitics and entered a far more intimate arena, the collective longing to be seen, heard, and treated with respect. And though pundits on opposite sides of the Atlantic continued to argue over whether her language had blurred the line between admiration and activism, it was clear the message had rooted itself far beyond the reach of televised punditry. The power of what had been said, grounded in history, carried by compassion, was now being carried further still by ordinary people. In the heart of Burkina Faso, a single phrase had traveled from a screen to a street, from a leader to a village, from a policy paper to a song. And as the camera faded out from the studio interview, viewers weren't left with applause or rebuttal, but with the image of Jasmine Crockett looking calmly ahead. Unapologetic, undeterred, and entirely understood by those who mattered most. In the early morning haze of rural Burkina Faso, where red clay paths wind between modest homes and acacia trees, a new day began like any other, until it didn't. A small girl named Adama, no older than 7, adjusted the strap on her faded canvas satchel and took a deep breath. Today was her first day of school. To the casual observer, it might have looked like an ordinary rite of passage. But for Adama, and for her village, it was a symbol of something far greater than education. It was the result of a shift in belief. Just months earlier, this schoolhouse had been little more than a rundown shelter, barely standing. Today, its walls bore murals of hands reaching out to one another, painted by volunteers inspired by a speech that had traveled thousands of miles. Jasmine Crockett had never met Adama, and yet her words had arrived long before the girl stepped through that classroom door. Her message, about dignity, about kindness, about the necessity of respect beyond borders, had sparked more than diplomatic dialogue. It had reawakened something buried beneath the weight of poverty, colonization, and political fatigue, hope. President Traoré, deeply moved by the international and domestic response, had committed new funds toward rebuilding rural schools, not as a show of charity, but as an act of reclamation. If the world won't recognize the value of our people, he had said, then we must show it to them through our actions, starting with our children. As Adama sat at her desk, the teacher, one of the first in her family to receive formal training, welcomed the students not with recitations, but with a question. "What does respect look like?" she asked. A few children pointed to the posters on the wall, others to their neighbors. Adama raised her hand slowly. "It's when someone believes I can learn," she said. Outside, the morning light settled on the mural words above the school's entrance, words from a congresswoman halfway across the world. Empathy and dignity, not dominance, are what create true, lasting change. The phrase wasn't just decoration. It was a commitment, quietly shaping the future through gestures both grand and simple. A road was being paved, not just of asphalt, but of ideas. Not through speeches alone, but through children walking, learning, dreaming. And in that moment, Adama's first steps into the classroom weren't just hers. They belonged to a movement set in motion by a voice that dared to speak differently, and a people who chose to listen. In a world that often mistakes silence for peace and power for wisdom, this story reminds us of something deeper. True leadership is rooted not in control, but in conscience. Whether spoken in a courtroom, whispered in a rural village, or felt in the unshakable dignity of someone unjustly stopped, the lesson is clear: how we treat others when no one is watching defines who we really are. From Jasmine Crockett's bold honesty to President Traoré's humble response, we see that empathy is not weakness, and dignity is not earned through status, but through how we listen, respect, and uplift. This story asks us to reflect: have we let assumptions shape our actions more than understanding? Have we valued order more than justice? For adults and seniors who have walked life's long road, this message carries even more weight. It is not too late to redefine what kind of legacy we leave. Not one of silence, but of speaking up when it matters, even with a whisper. Because sometimes, the quietest gestures hold the most power to change hearts, institutions, and futures. Folded hands. If this message moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story that matters. Every click helps us share voices that deserve to be heard.